Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I have picked up another one of the Space Marine heroes. I did one of these a few weeks ago, painted up in the Iron Hands chapter. So let's see which one we have today. Looks like we have a tactical marine with a bolter gun, by the looks of things, on a sort of nice plinth base there as well. So let's get this cut out and put together, and then we can paint it up. So here we have the model built and primed in Macragge Blue. I'm going to be painting this up as an Ultramarine tactical marine. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is block in the sort of under panel black lining cloth that they have underneath. This is sort of where the sort of knee joints are here, and obviously around the back as well. And occasionally they do, depending on the model, have them sort of visible into the sort of arm where the elbow is. So for this I'm going to use Black Templar just to sort of help it run a little bit easier into those areas. And this is just straight from the pot and going over. Now depending on sort of how large the area is, you may find that you need to do 2 coats of this, but if you do, then that's fine. Just make sure the first coat is completely dry first. Once you've filled in those black parts, we're going to move on to the next sort of base colour, which will be Lead Belcher. This is to cover all the silver areas of the model. Now don't worry too much about sort of tidying up the blue armour at this stage if you make any mistakes with these base colours we're putting down. So the black we've just done, the silver, and the next couple of colours as well. Just in case, so that you can then do sort of all your tidying up in one go before we apply any shades and highlights to the model. So getting that Lead Belcher onto the brush, the first part we're going to focus on is the gun itself, and this is the sort of bottom parts of the weapon here, as well as the handle and the back parts of that. We are also then going to do the sort of cabling in under the chest piece here. That will also need to be in silver, as well as the grenade strapped to his hip, both front and the back one as well. And then not forgetting the vents on the backpack, both the ones under the circular parts and also the lower vents as well. So take your time, work your way around the model, and then we can come back and tidy up later. Once you're happy with that Lead Belcher, we're going to move on to another base coat now, which is Wraithbone, and this is simply for the parchment and seal for the purity seal that is on the leg of the miniature. After that Wraithbone, we're going to be using Balthasar Gold, and this is to pick out the chest eagle on the front here, the trims of the shoulder pads as well. So just take your time to work your way around the model and pick out those details. Some bolt guns also have sort of half eagle on the crest. Some have different motifs as well. You can either choose to paint these in the silver, or you could perhaps paint them in white, depending on what symbol you've got there. But for this one, we will be coating it in the gold as well. Once you're happy with that Balthasar Gold, we're going to move on to the next base coat, which is Xandri Dust, and this is for the pouches on the model. So particularly this one between the 2 grenades, and then also the holster on his other hip holding the pistol. You may find you'll want a couple of coats of this to get a nice blocked in colour. Once you've applied that Xandri Dust, we're going to move on to the last of the base paints now, which is Abaddon Black. And this is to go over the gun casing for the bolt rifle. Do take your time, obviously try not to get anything over the Lead Belcher Silver or the Balthasar Gold that we have already painted on, but if you do, then just neaten up before moving on. Once you've painted that Abaddon black onto the bolt rifle, we are then going to move on to tidying up that blue before doing any shading. So just grabbing a pot of Macragge blue and just touch up any areas that you've covered up and accidentally touched with any other colour. So once you've neatened up, we can then move on to shading, and the first shade we're going to go on to is Nun Oil, and this is predominantly for all the silver areas of the miniature. So the magazine in his hand here, and obviously all of the silver parts of the main weapons themselves, so obviously not forgetting the pistol at the back or the backpack as well. But what we're also going to do, and you will want to make sure you've got a smaller brush for this, is a little bit of recess shading onto that blue panel armour. So this is predominantly for sort of any cracks in the armour. You can just sort of gently run your brush down and let it fill in the gaps. Now obviously you will get some staining on the other side of the miniature, but that's fine because we will neaten up with Macragge blue again afterwards. But just be very carefully, take your time round the miniature, and sort of anywhere that you feel may want the a little bit of darker recess shading, so sort of underneath any panel lines at the back here for instance, or at the front, particularly around the top part of the helmet. But you won't need a lot on your brush at all, just simply just sort of let it run into the recess. Once you're happy with that Nun Oil, the next thing we're going to do is move on to Snakebite Leather. This is a contrast paint, but goes very nicely over the top of Xandri Dust to give a sort of nice war-torn sort of leather effect. So we are going to pop that over the top, straight from the pot, and allow that to dry. The next shade we're going to move on to is Reichland Flesh Shade, and this is for all the gold areas of the model. Now you don't need to put this on too heavily, it is just to really pick out the sort of recesses of the gold plating, particularly for the chest eagle, and then just to give it a bit more definition on the other spots as well. So do take your time, just work your way around each of those areas. The next shades we're going to apply is for the Purity Seal. Now for the parchment area itself, we're going to coat over that Wraithbone with Agrax Earthshade, just to sort of dirty it down and give it a more sort of browny feel to it, as well as picking out the recesses that sit on top of that parchment. And then for the seal itself, we're going to use Volupus Pink and just put a nice coating of that over the top. The final shade we are then going to apply is Blood Angels Red, and this is into the eye sockets on the helmet. And now again, obviously keep a nice thin point to your brush, but as we come to tidy up from the recess shading on the armour panelling, we can also tidy up any sort of spillage that this goes over the rest of the helmet. Once you're happy with those shades and allow them to dry, we're going to move on to applying a few highlights to the model. And the first thing we're going to do is go back to Macragge Blue, and this is just to touch up and lighten up any areas that you touched with the Nun Oil, or any of the other shades perhaps that you didn't want necessarily to be as dark as they are. So it's just a good sort of basing point to start lightening up the armour again, ready for the actual highlight itself. So particularly with the one I've done, there's some sort of recess shading around the helmet here that sort of went a bit further down than I would have liked. So I'm just going to sort of touch up around the top of here to stop that from obviously showing through too much. Once you've done that neatening up with Macragge Blue, we're then going to move on to highlighting the blue armour, and for this we're going to be using Calgar Blue, which is quite a nice light blue and is a nice sort of contrast to the Macragge Blue overall. So just get a nice sort of thin tip to your brush, and we're going to sort of be picking out any of the sort of raised edges of the model. So particularly sort of around the top of the helmet here, there's the sort of crescent piece, and we're just going to sort of gently pick out the edges of that using the edge of the brush, and obviously the front as well. And then any other areas that you want to sort of stand out, so the sort of belt buckle here perhaps, to obviously add a bit of contrast there, and around the knee pads. Now do take your time when working around the knee pads, because obviously they are circular. Sometimes using the side of the brush doesn't always quite get where you need to be, or it can actually make it a bit messy. But if you do make any mistakes, then obviously the Macragge Blue is there to neaten up before. Once you're happy with that blue highlight, we're going to move on to highlighting the silver next, and for this we're going to be using Rune Fang steel, and this is to pick out sort of the sharpest edges and highlights for the model. So particularly if you're looking at this magazine here, there's the sort of rim that runs across the top. You can pick out that, and then any sort of sharp corner edges on there as well, just to make those stand out a little bit more from the rest of the canister. And then the same sort of principle for the grenade as well. You can sort of pick out some of the individual points of the grenade, so the ring pull for instance, and the same for the sort of circular, more smooth one at the back, just sort of dotting on some light points there for where the light would be sure to hit it. And then when looking at the sort of main bolt gun itself, again just sort of picking out sort of sharpest edges, so sort of the tips of the barrel there, sort of some inlays of the handlebar, and also sort of some sharp edges around the back here as well. But do take your time, work your way around the model, and once you're ready we can move on to the next highlight. Once you're happy with those silver highlights, we're going to move on to highlighting up the gold areas now, and for this we're going to be using Liberator Gold. And this is just to pick out sort of the raised edges, particularly when looking at the chest eagle, just sort of picking out so the top part, and then sort of any raised sort of feathers of that, sort of picking them out. Obviously try and keep the shading and the Balthasar gold in the recesses. This is just to make that shine just a little bit more. And then particularly then obviously with the shoulder pads as well, just sort of picking certain spots on the shoulder pads to sort of brighten them up in comparison to the Balthasar gold underneath, just where the light would mostly touch onto the panel. Next up we're going to highlight the black casing of the weapon itself, and for this we're going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this is a very sort of standard edge highlight, picking out the sort of sharp corner edges of the rifle itself. Next up, for those leather pouches, we're going to go back to Zandri Dust, and this time instead of obviously applying as a base coat, we are just going to use it as an edge highlight to just pick out the raised edges around the pouches and holster. And then as a final highlight to the miniature, we're going to get a little bit of Emperor's Children just to highlight over the wax seal for the purity seal. And there we have a finished Space Marine. The only thing left for you to do now is to base the miniature in whichever way you feel is best. Now obviously a lot of these come with a sort of textured base, so you can obviously fill that in with whatever colours best befits the rest of your army. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions at all, just leave them in the comments below. I will come back to you. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.